So good morning. I'm Mabel Wilson. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to echo Pier Niccolò's gratitude to a number of the organizations that brought us all here. It's been a pleasure to have conversations with Emily and Pier Niccolò about this topic, and I think we'll have some really interesting, because I was looking at our presentations have very similar types of images, paintings, invoices, and so on. So even though we're talking about slightly different periods and different geographies, there are many overlaps, but that's the kind of world of globality that I think comes together. And yesterday's conversations were amazing. So I'm very honored to sort of be following up, but a special thanks to Gaetan for organizing this amazing event, and also Kipwani for that fantastic project that I think has prompted a lot of wonderful thinking. Okay, so perfect. Mundane, quotidian, seeming inconsequential trinkets, as rendered visible in Kipwani's brilliant installation, in all of their beauty and horror, made not only empire, but modernity. To be sure, it was Europe's merchants and traders and factors, prime ministers, politicians, monarchs, missionaries, planters, bankers, boat builders, rope makers, blacksmiths, engineers, and architects who constructed the financial and infrastructural apparatus of the transatlantic slave trade. Across 4 continents, the trade's transactional networks connected through a number of spaces: depots, jails, ports, workshops, manufacturers, warehouses, auction houses, plantation, banks, custom houses, offices, stores, and great houses. The resources and wealth gleaned from these colonial routes of trade in human flesh, raw materials, and finished products like seed beads allowed white Europeans, which also eventually included the working classes of the 20th century, to thrive under mercantile then industrial capitalist expansion, while the denial of resources and the theft of wealth incrementally killed, and I used Denise Ferreira de Silva's term, Europe's others in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So my talk today will trace through 3 different vignettes, sometimes that are overlapping and entangled, to use that term. My talk will trace the circulation of material objects, people, free and unfree, but also ideas, within 3 such networks that formed in the second half of the 18th century: mahogany and freedom. In 1761, an 8-year-old girl was purchased as a domestic servant by a Boston family. Her white enslavers named her Phyllis, after the brigantine Phyllis that had transported her from Senegambia as their property. She was given the last name of Wheatley. The family were evangelical Christians whose beliefs emphasized an emotional connection to God and promoted congregational autonomy. And to achieve that bond, literacy, the ability to read the Word of God, was essential, even for those who were enslaved. So Phyllis learned English, then mastered Greek and Latin, which was a rare educational opportunity for an enslaved person, one that was outlawed in most parts of the British colonies, for fear that a slave who could read and write posed a danger to white domination. Inspired by the classical verses of Homer and the neoclassical poems of John Milton and Alexander Pope, Phyllis began to write poetry, publishing her first one in the Newport Mercury in 1767. Wheatley's poetry engaged the political spheres of letters, or arts and letters as we call it today, one shaped on one hand by the Enlightenment's classical forms of political discourse, and on the other by the moral imperatives of Christianity. Now, Phyllis lived in the Wheatley's house on King and Mackerel Streets of Boston until 1774, when she gained her freedom. But unfortunately, there are no descriptions of this house, particularly its interior layout, to better understand how daily life for an enslaved young woman would have unfolded. Now, one example that approximates the Wheatley's domestic milieu is this embroidered work from 1783 by Prudence Punderson. So it's slightly later, but it gives you a sense of what a New England domestic space might have looked like. And Punderson was a free white woman who also lived in New England in Preston, Connecticut, not too far from Boston. Now, Punderson crafted in silk thread, you have to wonder where the silk actually came from, and cloth, an arc of her birth, life, and death within the intimate spaces of a New England household. In her tableau, she depicts herself drawing at a tea table, similar to the one in Wheatley's portrait. Punderson placed herself sitting between a wooden crib holding a baby and a drop leaf table upon which sat a coffin embellished with PP. Around her, she gathers her cherished possessions, which included an enslaved girl who sits dutifully watching sleeping baby Prudence. These domestic possessions served as props to stage an allegory of her own mortality. And in doing so, Punderson portrays the intimacies, to deploy scholar Lisa Lowe's term, characterizing liberal interiority and domesticity. All right, this is the self, right, of modernity. But rather than portray Phyllis as a prop in the Wheatley's family tableau, which in fact as property she was, the depiction of a young poet at a tea table, deep in her own thought and immersed in her craft, which is attributed to the Black Boston artist Scipio Moorhead, was a radical portrayal of Black self-fashioning within a white New England household and within slave-owning British North American society. Now, enmeshed in the same networks of arts and letters where he encountered Wheatley's book, Poems of Various Subjects, Religious and Morals, which was published in London in 1773. Now, this was published in London because they could not find an American publisher, particularly in Boston. And if you ever looked at the book, there were just, sort of endless attestments that she did, in fact, write this, because there was so much doubt that a young Black woman could actually have a mind with ideas. So someone who encountered this book was this man, Thomas Jefferson. He crafted the Declaration of Independence. He designed Virginia's State House, a model for U.S. civic architecture. But to Jefferson, Wheatley possessed the inferior traits of both her race and gender. Now, despite her remarkable achievements under the harshest of circumstances, Jefferson observes in his only published book, Notes on the State of Virginia from 1785, that Phyllis Wheatley was incapable of writing poetry, since love for the Negro could only stimulate the senses, but not the imagination. So the body, but not the mind. And yet, in her poem On Imagination, Wheatley proclaims, soaring through the air to find a bright abode, the imperial palace of a thundering god, as a gesture of creative and conceptual play of a liberated subject, which many scholars have claimed foreshadows Immanuel Kant's arguments in the Critique of Judgment. Furthermore, Jefferson demeans Wheatley's poems as being, quote, below the dignity of criticism, end quote. But nonetheless, Wheatley's skillful deployment of classicism entered seamlessly into the discourse of a newly forming revolutionary public sphere helmed by Jefferson and other white male founding fathers like Benjamin Franklin and so on. Both Wheatley and Jefferson proclaimed that slavery was a morally corrupting force that must be ended. Wheatley believed that freedom from enslavement for Africans must be a part of the revolutionary agenda, whereas Jefferson offered, and this is in Notes on the State of Virginia, a gradual plan of emancipation and self-deportation back to Africa. Wheatley sought liberation at the moment of political rupture to ensure that she, her family, and other enslaved Africans could live as free Americans. By contrast, Jefferson deferred emancipation in order to live off his investments in a slave-owning society. And in fact, when he died, I believe he had only freed 3 of the 600 enslaved people he owned over his lifetime. Now, upon return from London book tour in 1773, Phyllis Wheatley was, in fact, freed by John Wheatley, who honored an agreement that was made prior to her journey. 5 years later, Phyllis Wheatley married a Black shopkeeper and laborer, John Peters, who was free. They moved often around Boston because financial security as free Blacks remained elusive under white domination. She bore children, although the number and their fate remain unknown. She also experienced intermittent bouts of ill health. Further, Wheatley failed to find a publisher for a second book of poetry and letters and died indigent in Boston at age 31 in December of 1784. Though he was 10 years older than Wheatley, Thomas Jefferson lived till age 83, dying in 1826. Now, once Wheatley gained her freedom, like many other free blacks, the archival trail in legal documents like wills and bill of sales and manumission papers disappeared, given the limitation on free blacks to acquire property or seek legal redress. They literally disappear. Domestic commodities and craft objects like furniture, fabric, and embroidery can be evidence of those whose lives do not readily appear in the archives. Thus, the only rare artifact believed to be owned by Wheatley is a convertible mahogany tea table and desk dated to 1760. The mahogany table is a trace that appeared, as scholar Saidiya Hartman proposes, at the moment of Wheatley's disappearance. Now, albeit a humble object from her domestic space, the table's mahogany traveled the same transatlantic trade routes as the young captured girl who would be renamed Phyllis Wheatley, and this is something that Michael talked about yesterday. The enclosure and theft of indigenous lands in the Caribbean by European colonists to establish plantations necessitated the deforestation undertaken by crews of enslaved Africans. By the early 18th century, large quantities of mahogany were shipped as ballast from places like Barbados and Jamaica to furniture makers in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and London. Scholar Elaine Feelgood demystifies the allegorical presence of mahogany in later Victorian novels like Jane Eyre as, quote, the furniture that remembers, as it were, the ubiquity of slavery in the geography and the history of the Atlantic trade, end quote. Mahogany also unsettles the liberal interiority by situating it, as scholar Lisa Lowe argues, quote, in relation to the global processes and colonial connections that are the conditions of its production, end quote. So for Wheatley and Jefferson, the ownership of mahogany furniture facilitated different degrees of utility and self-fashioning in a world of arts and letters, but also within the gendered and classed spaces of culture and taste. And you see here, this is a portable desk that Jefferson may have used to write notes on the state of Virginia. And these portable desks, or some of them are believed to have been crafted by John Hemmings, who was enslaved at Monticello. Yet for Wheatley, despite her tenacity, intellectual acuity, and creative insights into a world in which the precious freedom of the revolutionary moment was erected on the backs of the unfree, the unceasing violence of anti-Black racism that began in the abyss of the hold of the brigantine Phyllis rapidly extinguished poet Phyllis's flight to her bright abode shortly after she had secured her own freedom. Slaves and democracy. In 1792, Henry Lawrence recommended the Irish architect James Hoban to his friend, President George Washington. Hoban would become the architect for the new president's house in the still yet to be completed new capital, Washington City. Now, Lawrence was a South Carolina merchant and plantation owner based in Charleston. He served as the 5th president of the Second Continental Congress. This was the one that had written the Declaration of Independence. This was the provisional body governing the U.S. during the U.S. War for Independence. In addition to being a wealthy planter, wealth inherited from his father, Lawrence was also what was called a factor, a person who is a trade representative for merchants doing business in a particular region. He had become a partner in one of the most successful Charlestonian trading firms, Lawrence and Austin, with merchant George Austin. Lawrence and Austin specialized in trades in all kinds of agricultural goods, sundries, and commodities. One lucrative area for the firm was trading in local crops of rice and indigo for thousands of Negro slaves from the Caribbean and African needed for the lowland plantations. Trading in what Charlestonians called guineamen, Lawrence and Austin's were paid a 10% commission, doubling the typical 5% on other goods. So in 1756, Lawrence and Austin's contracted with Grant, Oswald and Company to ship enslaved men, women, and boys and girls, many knowledgeable about rice cultivation, through an infrastructure built inside the former Royal African Company fort on Bunce Island in the river Sierra Leone in Western Africa. Richard Oswald, was a wealthy Scottish merchant based in London who also owned plantations in Virginia, Florida, and Georgia. He was also a friend to fellow Scotsman Adam Smith, and Oswald shared Smith's advocacy for dismantling state monopolies to open markets to free trade. From profits of the slave sales in Charleston, Lawrence, Austin, and Oswald would purchase hogsheads of rice and ship it and other goods to London. Thousands of often physically depleted men, women, boys, and girls arrived to Charleston's slave markets for sale. So as this ledger, which is an entry from September 14th to the 28th of 1757 notes, Austin and Lawrence managed a sale of 195 slaves from Calabar, which is now Nigeria, brought to Charleston on the King David, owned by Bristol merchants. Even after 10 days of quarantine outside of Charleston, the ledger notes that, quote, almost all of the slaves after the first day's sales were swelted, or other was disordered, and great numbers of them are since dead. Of the 56 sold for now, there are but few alive, end quote. According to other logs about the King David's trip, 352 enslaved people had been taken into captivity from Calabar, but only 287 disembarked at Charleston to be put up for auction to planter traders and other factors. The cruel calculus of the slave trade meant that 65 Africans died in the Middle Passage, and approximately 92, if not more, died while awaiting sales in the markets of Charleston. In 1778, Lawrence was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London for his activities in the U.S. War for Independence. His slave trading partner, Richard Oswald, negotiated his release. 2 years later, Lawrence traveled to Paris to join other founding fathers, John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, to broker the Treaty of Paris with Great Britain and other European powers to end the war and to establish the United States. The British would send as their chief negotiator slave trader Richard Oswald. The trade in slaves underwrote U.S. independence. And apparently Oswald was supposed to appear in this painting, but the British refused. So this is why this is this incomplete painting of the Treaty of Paris. Negro shoes and property. One of the last invoices sent and paid by the commissioners of the city of Washington was for 11 pairs of Negro shoes for laborers finished construction tasks at the President's House from September 1799 to March 1800. The merchant's $16.50 invoice for, quote, pump leather Negro shoes was fulfilled on April 2nd, 1800 by Paymaster Thomas Monroe and witnessed by Samuel Smallwood, who was the overseer of the U.S. Capitol construction site. Now, Thomas Corcoran, seen here, who immigrated to Maryland from Ireland in 1769, had for several years provided pairs of Negro shoes as a local merchant who traded in tobacco and grains. Now, Corcoran was also Georgetown's first elected mayor in 1795. He would become one of the wealthiest residents, riches he made in part from land speculation in Washington City. His son, William Wilson Corcoran, established the Corcoran Gallery of Art, the nation's first art museum. Now, Corcoran drafted his invoice in an organized manner, with each of the 11 lines providing a date, the pair of shoes, provided to each enslaved man, Ned, Joseph, Harry, Edward, Jacob, Salisbury, Ned, different owner, and Sam. The name of the enslaver, Walker, Blake, Briscoe, Stone, and Brent, and the price to be deducted from wages. So, for example, December 13th, for Negro Harry, property of Miss E. Brent, 11 shillings and 3 pence. The same worker, Harry, received shoes on March 19th, 1800, and other workers named Ned and Jacob also appeared twice. The repetition of the purchase perhaps signals that for the men, the construction tasks were arduous and repetitious during their typical 6-day work week. It may have been strategic to purchase leather pump, slip-on type shoes for slaves because these shoes might quickly disintegrate on rough roads and in forest paths in order to circumvent escape attempts. In Harry's case, from fleeing north or south to his community 40 miles away in Charles County. In total, the market in slave clothing, like the popular coarse linen Osnaburg, originally made in Osnabrück, Germany, created an identifiable sign of one's enslaved status. Its fragile materiality and poor quality reinforced a condition of impoverishment and disinvestment in their humanness, despite the fact that these men and boys represented huge financial investment in their labor potential. Now, the entries on Corcoran's invoice registered the routine dispossession through the racialized title Negro and the eradication of kinship by the absence of a last name, replaced by the designation of property. So in accordance to the invoice, Harry, sometimes known as Henry, was not a self-possessed individual and thus could not claim himself as son, as husband, or as citizen, as defined by U.S. law and custom. By contrast, Harry's enslaver, a well-off white landowner who received the slaves Harry, Gabriel, and Fanny from the estate of her father, Robert Brent, was identified on the invoice by the status of her title, Miss Elizabeth, and her kinship as a member of the Brent family, early English Catholic settlers of the region. Harry, whose age was unknown, as are the specific tasks that he undertook for the wages beneficial to his owner, Elizabeth Brent, was one of the last Negro hires by the commissioners who built Washington City. Harry worked as a laborer, perhaps clearing and loading into carts construction waste, stone, bricks, lumber, mahogany, at the president's house through August 1800 and before Congress arrived 3 months later in November of that year. So the modern states, to conclude, regulatory and administrative structure also evolved from the ways metropoles like Boston, Charleston, Washington City, London, Bristol, Paris, Vance Island, and all of the trading posts along the African coast for how they developed new techniques to subjugate indigenous, enslaved, and colonized population, and invented new technologies of war and extraction to claim more land and more raw material. Various African peoples forced into slavery were carried to the New World because of their knowledge of cultivating tobacco, rice, indigo, and other crops. To rationalize their violent subjection and ruthless conquest, white Euro-Americans imagined they possessed superior intellect, morals, and physiques in comparison to those whom they deemed racially inferior. The colonial apparatus was insatiable for its quest for human and material resources like mahogany, indigo, rice, shoes, and country beans, and more, in order to build the great fortunes of the elite and mercantile classes and to accumulate more power for the ruling class. Bead by bead, as trinket brings to light, this was how empire was built. Thank you.